Good afternoon, folks. Or good afternoon to everyone in the Central and the Eastern time zones. Good morning to those of you in the Mountain and Pacific. We'd like to get started now, and I will start here with a brief reintroduction of myself for those of you, especially those of you West Coasters for whom 7 a.m. might have been a little bit early for a financial aid optimization workshop. My name is Mike Keene. I'm the Senior Vice President of Modeling and Client Strategy at Carnegie. My background is in quantitative modeling, but also in enrollment research. And I also spent several years as a chief financial aid officer at a four-year private institution. And that's what leads us to today's topic, which is preparing for the new FAFSA. A few housekeeping notes. And for those of you that weren't in prior sessions, there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the conclusion of the session. If you'd like to ask a question and have that posed for consideration, please use the Q&A function on the Zoom. Second housekeeping note is that all of these sessions are being recorded, and so you'll have the opportunity to have access to both the presentation and the recorded session later on. The last note that I'll make for this session specifically is that we know that we have a variety of different institutional types and sizes and different colleagues with us today. Some of you who are current members of financial aid offices, including counselors, assistant associate directors, and directors of financial aid, for whom the new FAFSA is principally about the very technical details of ensuring you have what you need from students for timely and accurate packaging of federal, state, and institutional aid. We also know we have colleagues with us who are in enrollment leadership or in admission leadership roles that may have less familiarity with financial aid. I hope that you're both able to get something from this. I hope certainly as we pitch the content at the level of specificity, we've designed to make it sort of generally applicable to folks in enrollment and enrollment leadership. That means that for some of our financial aid friends, there might not be as many technical details in this presentation as you'll expect and as you'll get from a NASPA presentation or from the Department of Education webinars that are being made available. But I do hope for our financial aid folks, you do get to learn and hear and think a bit more about communication and about student facing and recruitment aspects. For those of you that are in admission and or enrollment leadership and don't have a financial aid background, I hope we're presenting enough of the technical details for you to get sufficient understanding, sufficient depth of understanding to be conversant in these, and also not for nothing, to understand what your financial aid colleagues are going through as we adapt to both the extent of the changes that are coming, but also, and in particular, the uncertainty around these changes. To get started, we'll talk about briefly what will change for students with the new FAFSA, move on to what will impact you and how it will impact you and your institution, spend some time, and I think this is where we want to spend a significant amount of time, is how can you prepare and adapt? And again, this is partly about, even if we knew everything about the new FAFSA, we would need to do pretty significant work to adapt the challenges. On top of that, we don't even know yet when it will be available, and that creates additional challenges for how you communicate with prospective students and how you design your internal timelines. Last, we want to identify some resources that are out there, whether they're from NASPA, whether they're from the Department of Education, whether they're other resources. And in particular, I want to identify and flag for you a resource that might be great if you are socializing the changes that are coming with non-enrollment and non-financial aid colleagues at your institution. That might even include a board member, a president, a provost, a CFO, colleagues in academic affairs, colleagues in student affairs and student life. And we want to make sure that we provide resources that allow you to provide accessible, plain English explanations of what can otherwise be often very technical topics. And then, as I mentioned, as questions come up, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A function in Zoom, and my colleague Ben will be keeping an eye on those, and we'll bring those to the front once we're concluded. First, I think it's important to acknowledge the challenge, because the challenge here is significant. A new FAFSA and a new measure of student aid eligibility, the transition from the expected family contribution to the student aid index, increases complexity and introduces uncertainty for our populations. And our populations are our prospective students. For our students that are dependent undergraduates, it's often their parents and their family members. But there's also significant complexity and uncertainty for us on the institutional side, for the work that we do on behalf of students, for the work we do that connects to other colleagues on campus. And the additional challenge is that we don't yet know when the FAFSA will be available. Obviously, the original intention was that it would be available on October 1st, as has been the case for about 7 years now, but learned in the first quarter of 2023 from the Department of Ed that the only promise they can make is that it will be available by the end of the 2023 calendar year. I hope that at the federal update at the NASFA annual meeting next week in San Diego, there might be a bit more clarity on availability, and I have my fingers crossed for a December 1 or a December 15 commitment instead of just by the end of the year. But the delayed availability and not having a date to plan for is an additional disruption to institutional planning. It also, and in particular, when we think about as enrollment leaders, it makes it more difficult for you to give clear roadmaps to your prospective populations, to students, to parents, to family members, even to your colleagues and partners at high schools, at two-year institutions, at nonprofits, even FAFSA workshops that are being offered in faith communities and parishes. The variety of different folks with both internal and external to your community that are involved in counseling students about marshaling the financial resources and making sure that they are availing themselves of every resource available, and want to be conscious of how much this uncertainty impacts those populations. There's also, even in a year when not much is changing, so let's say the period from 2017 to 2022, when we had prior year and we had an October 1 FAFSA, even in those years, it was not necessarily a simple or straightforward task to do something that financial aid professionals call rolling aid years, which means getting ready to intake data from the FAFSA from students filed through the Department of Ed, process that data, get it into your student information systems or into your packaging routines, and then in a timely and accurate fashion, package students with what can be quite complex calculations of federal and state gift aid, federal and federal loans, and then also federal work awards, state grants, institutional gift aid, which can include grants or scholarships. In some cases, is contingent on FAFSA data. So in a good year, especially as you're working with vendors, if you have a student information system vendor, or if your student information system is managed internally, there are often challenges already with adapting to a new aid year. Those are exacerbated by a new FAFSA and the uncertainty. So what we want to focus on today is not just the what, but also not just the what and the when of the changes, but also what you can do over the course of the next 6 months to be ready. While it would be great if we had an October availability, and that would give us additional time for planning and additional time, an extra few months to be ready for these changes before we're packaging students, if we're packaging them in the spring, there is still significant opportunity over the course of the next few months to prepare yourselves, prepare your offices, prepare your colleagues on campus, and communicate to and prepare your prospective populations for this change. I also want to be attentive to the fact that there are silver linings here, that at least on the institutional side, some of the positive outcomes of the new FAFSA have been buried in the last 3 months by this uncertainty around its availability and anxiety about what this means for our institutional processes and timelines. But the silver lining is that the new FAFSA will be shorter and will be easier to complete for most students and families. And of course, this was one of the original driving rationales of FAFSA simplification and why it's called FAFSA simplification in the first place. The acknowledgement that the FAFSA, partly by virtue of trying to be a form that accommodates a variety of different scenarios and circumstances, has tended to be a form that doesn't work particularly well for any population. In that sense, it's not particularly different from some of the tax documents and tax forms that are designed to accommodate every possible situation and therefore don't do a great job of specifically capturing certain populations or circumstances. So the fact that the FAFSA will be shorter and that it will be easier to complete is without question a win for students and a win for institutions. The FAFSA also makes it available, and those of you in aid offices that weathered the storm of the IRS data retrieval tool over the past 10 years of availability, and then I think the almost 2 years that it was offline and then back available, and trying to coach students and families through using the DRT, the new FAFSA does make it easier for families to be able to directly share data between the IRS and the Department of Education for the purposes of populating the information for the tax year within scope for tax year 2022 in this case. And that means a more seamless process and ideally fewer questions for your offices to answer. You might be already familiar with this, but one of the things of the FAFSA being shorter and easier to complete is that there are also more paths to maximum Pell Grant eligibility, meaning that the Pell Grant eligibility calculations are changed a bit such that it is easier based on certain specific triggers around tax filing and around adjusted gross income as a percentage of the state poverty line to be able to qualify quickly for the maximum Pell. This means that there are also students who have Pell that will now have more Pell Grant, and there are students that previously had been excluded from Pell Grant eligibility that will now be eligible. This is critical for institutions, that particularly for those of you that already have significant Pell Grant populations, 20, 30, 40% or more of your undergraduate students receiving a Pell Grant, this is without question a significant injection of additional grant aid resources for your populations, both current and prospective populations, to be able to meet their payment obligations at your institution. It also, and I think this has been overshadowed a bit, for those of us that remember the bad old days, we're not going back to the bad old days. The bad old days were when not only did the FAFSA use the most immediate prior year tax information or income information, it was also available January 1st. And that put offices in the position of saying to families who didn't even have their tax documentation from their employers until the end of January often, to say, well, provide estimated information. And that meant that families would provide estimated information in January, February, and be going back and correcting that in March and April and May and June, or even well into the summer and closer to the start of the semester for traditional fall and fall starts. The other thing was that because it was available January 1st, that dictated institutional deadlines, that if you had a FAFSA priority deadline of February 1st or of March 1st, students and families often had a relatively limited window of time to provide the information that was also relevant to the year that had just concluded. So while it is difficult and not ideal that we'll be waiting until December for the FAFSA availability this year, we still do preserve that prior year. And that means that by the time the FAFSA is available, the vast majority, virtually every family, including those who filed for a tax extension or a tax filing extension, will have the information available to them to fill out the portions from the relevant tax year. Last, it's important to note that some students will receive additional Pell Grant eligibility or will have a maximum Pell Grant. Some students will now have some Pell Grant eligibility where previously they had none. And then most students won't actually see a material change to federal, state, or institutional aid eligibility, especially when it comes to gift aid. So we'll talk through technically what the SAI and the differences between the SAI and the EFC and what that means for students and families. But the reality is that for many students, this won't be a material change. And that includes the fact that for new prospective students, for students that are new to your institution or new to higher education, this won't be a change. This is just the FAFSA, and it's the FAFSA that they will always know as the FAFSA. Really, it's more about your continuing students, or it's about your families where they have an older sibling that is already in college or is completing college, where they have an experience of the prior FAFSA, and for them, it might be an adjustment. But for most students, it won't materially change their aid eligibility, especially their gift aid eligibility, and it won't be a change because it might be the only FAFSA that they know. So speaking of change, what will change for students? So the first and probably the headline for the FAFSA, new FAFSA, beyond the simplification, is the student aid index. So we're transitioning from the expected family contribution to the student aid index. And my colleagues who work in financial aid know that the feds have always been pretty clear, the Department of Ed has always been pretty clear that yes, it's called the expected family contribution, but really it is intended principally to be a measure of eligibility for federal need-based aid. And the fact that it's called an expected family contribution leads folks reasonably to believe that this is designed to be a measure of how much you can contribute to your education, whether your own or your daughter or son's education. But the reality was the Department of Ed said this is intended to be an index that determines eligibility for federal need-based aid. To the extent that states and institutions and other nonprofit organizations want to use this measure to provide their own need-based aid, that's up to them. But it is designed to be a measure of an index of eligibility for federal need-based aid. Student aid index captures that a little bit more in a little bit more straightforward manner than expected family contribution. Now, to the extent that this will stop the parents and the families and the students from saying my EFC is wildly unrealistic to now just saying this SAI is wildly unrealistic, I don't know. But the reality is that there is a subtle change in naming here that signals a broader change in that reflects how the Department of Education has typically talked about the EFC. It's also important to note that for most students, the SAI will be fundamentally similar to what their EFC would have been. Although for most students, it will be slightly lower. I think in the simulations, typically we're seeing $1,500, $2,000, $2,500 lower. That's principally because the income protection allowance, or the amount of the family's income that is not considered in the SAI calculation, is about $5,000 or $6,000 higher than it was under the EFC. It's the rough equivalent of an exemption on your taxes being increased such that you're excluding a larger portion of your income from taxation. In this case, is a larger portion of income excluded from consideration in the SAI formula. And that means that for some students, if it's not making them eligible for new gift aid, it might change slightly eligibility for subsidized loan versus unsubsidized loan. But for the most students, the SAI is going to be fundamentally similar to the EFC. It's also important, again, to acknowledge here that for most families, they won't have this hypothetical comparison. In other words, they won't have entered the exact same data in a hypothetical EFC calculation and an SAI calculation. They will have maybe an EFC from the prior aid year, which is right now basically the current aid year, 23-24. And then they will have an SAI for the aid year 24-25. But lots of other things will change, or could change, between tax years 21 and 22 that affect those. So you could have changes in income. You could have changes in assets at the time they're completing the FAFSA. You could have changes in family size. There's a variety of other changes that can occur that could change an EFC from one year to the next, that mean that there aren't a lot of families that will have an apples to apples comparison of SAI to EFC. But for those who might be making this comparison, if other lower than the EFC. Now, I keep saying most and many, and the question is, how many is most, right? Because you could say most is 51% or most is 95%. And those are two very different answers. It depends on the answer. It depends on your populations. It depends on the data inputs. But the good news is that you can find out, and we'll talk about how. In particular, those who are not required to file a federal tax return, the SAI will be allowed to go negative. Now, the SAI going negative won't change the Pell Grant calculation, but it will permit students to receive more than the cost of attendance in all forms of financial aid. And that's a relatively technical aspect that your financial aid colleagues and the financial aid colleagues on the call are in the Zoom are familiar with, which is that packaging aid from all sources, you're not permitted to exceed the cost of attendance. This would mean that for students with the highest need, you are technically permitted to exceed the cost of attendance because you have that additional room to package with available aid. Now, for most students, is that going to be gift aid? Probably not. It's going to be loans. It might even be Parent Plus loans. But for some students, it will make them eligible for additional grant aid. I mentioned the more paths to maximum Pell Grant eligibility. I want to share here a figure from NASFA, and then I also want to note that I don't want you to strain your eyes trying to interpret the individual paths here. This is something that's available in the resources that we'll share links to as part of the presentation and at the conclusion of the presentation. But the idea here is that there are a variety of paths here reflected by the pink, the blue, and the green, where students and families can automatically be routed into buckets that make them eligible for the maximum Pell Grant based on relatively straightforward answers to the FAFSA. So if it's a dependent student whose parents didn't file taxes for the tax year, or an independent student who didn't file taxes for the applicable tax year, if the answer is no, it's a maximum Pell. There's this is a much smaller population, students under the age of 33 who are children of post 9/11 veteran or public safety officers who passed away in the line of duty are automatically eligible for maximum Pell. But these green buckets down here in the middle are a bigger change. And that's that depending on whether it's a single or a dual parent household, if the adjusted gross income is under a certain threshold for the state, based on the poverty line, that student will be eligible for the maximum Pell. And when we do these simulations where we're testing out who does this affect, this is probably where, when students are receiving additional grant aid, it is typically because they are being routed into these green buckets based on this more straightforward interpretation of eligibility and are now eligible for maximum Pell, when in a prior year they might have been eligible for only a partial Pell or ineligible for Pell, depending on the specific state and the specific AGI. So again, I don't want to spend too much time on the different paths here. This is a relatively technical point, except to say that I want all of us to come away from this with the understanding that it does qualify more students for maximum Pell Grants based on a slightly more straightforward way to route students into those categories. I mentioned that most students won't be fundamentally different in their aid eligibility, that some students will receive additional Pell or now be eligible for maximum Pell when they weren't eligible for Pell. There are some students that will lose aid eligibility, and unfortunately, when these students are impacted, it could be significant. So the new FAFSA, like the old FAFSA, will ask students and families to indicate how many in their family will be attending college in the applicable aid year, the applicable academic year. The change is that won't actually be used in the calculation of SAI the way it was used in the calculation of EFC. And so those of you that are familiar with this, it's sometimes been termed the sibling discount. Effectively, what it means is that when you consider, especially for dependent students, a parental contribution to the EFC, if the contribution would have been a $10,000 EFC, but there are 2 children in college, the parental contribution is cut in half and becomes $5,000. And then we start to get into Pell Grant eligibility, where a $10,000 EFC has no Pell Grant eligibility. This means that for some students, this could mean an SAI that is significantly higher than a hypothetical equivalent EFC and could result in the loss of federal, state, or institutional aid. The most confusing part here is that the FAFSA is going to continue to ask, and this is the draft print version that was prepared in March, about family size and number in college, but it's not going to be used. I think there is a silver lining here, which is that this will help institutions identify the students that are likely to have been most significantly impacted by this change, but it is going to result in confusion on why are they asking about the number in college if it's not being used in the calculation. NASPA provides a case study for loss of Pell Grant eligibility due to the change of in the treatment of multiple in college that I think is helpful here. In this case, this is a dependent student, a 2-parent household. The parents are married, 6 in the household, 3 in college, parent income of $110,000, student income of $3,700, parent assets of $104,000. Under the EFC formula, there's eligibility for a small Pell Grant because this 3 in college is taken into consideration in the formula. Under the SAI, even though the income protection allowance is higher, and that means that the SAI would otherwise be lower than the EFC, because this 3 in college is no longer considered, the SAI is substantially higher than the EFC would have been and disqualifies the student for Pell Grant. Now, the reality is that the change for most students from an EFC in the $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 range to the $18,000 range might be less about Pell and more about institutional need-based aid, subsidized federal loans, and other forms of aid that also use the EFC and now will use the SAI as an input. But I do think it's important that as we talk about, many students will not be particularly affected. Some students will receive additional grant aid. There is a population of students who have siblings in college in the 24-25 aid year that will see a potential significant loss of aid eligibility. And we'll talk a bit later about how we might address those. So if that's the initial sense and a relatively high level sense of which students will be impacted and in what ways, we also want to consider how this will impact institutions. Your dates and deadlines may need to change. Now, this is entirely contingent on how early you moved your dates and deadlines based on the availability of the October 1 FAFSA in prior years. Effectively, if you have FAFSA priority deadlines in the fall, between October 1 and December 31, or if you begin packaging students with gift aid, not estimated gift aid, but actual gift aid prior to the 31st, you'll need to review and adjust those dates because it is unlikely that you will have consistent FAFSA information or anything beyond a trickle of FAFSA information before December 15th or even December 31st, depending on when the FAFSA is available. If you have FAFSA deadlines that are early in the spring, Jan 15, Feb 1, Feb 15, they still may need to be adjusted for 2 reasons. One is you want to give students and families sufficient time to complete the FAFSA, which thankfully, again, will be shorter and more straightforward for most families, but still important to consider that you want to give them sufficient time to complete it. But even more so from my perspective is, again, in a good year where nothing is changing except for rolling forward the aid year, there is a challenge around adapting to your processes, adapting file layouts, working with your vendor if you have a student information system vendor like Ellucian or Workday or the College Board, to make sure that you are ready to receive this data from the department, to process it, and then to package student aid. One of the recommendations we'll make is to have consistent communication with your vendor or internally on your campus, or both if you, depending on how your SIS is configured, because moving some of those dates and deadlines is as much about giving you the time to process the information as it is about giving students and parents the time to provide the information. Second, and this is probably the number one question we get from our partner institutions, is your institutional gift aid strategy may need review. And that means that anytime an institution awards institutional financial aid, and that could be grants, it could be institutional loans, it could even be institutionally specific work study programs. If you have awarded those in the past and plan to award them in the future based on the EFC or now the SAI, or if you award it based on a definition that is downstream from EFC, based on something like unmet need after all forms of gift aid, that may need review. The second piece, and this is where I've seen more significant risk for some institutions, is that we have partner institutions that award some institutional aid automatically based on Pell Grant eligibility. This could be things like we have, and this is not just private four-year institutions, but also public four-year institutions that will say Pell Grant recipients won't owe any net tuition and fees. In other words, tuition and fees are fully covered if you're a Pell Grant recipient. Well, if you're a Pell Grant recipient in prior years was informed by a pretty consistent multi-year understanding of how many Pell Grant recipients you would have in your incoming class. Now the challenge is, not to mention your continuing students, now the challenge is you need to estimate how many Pell Grant students you'll have to calculate what the expenditure exposure is if you were to plan to continue to offer that policy. So the critical thing here is, how can you assess expenditure risk for your institutional aid based on FAFSA inputs? And we'll talk about that in a moment. Here's two examples. These are pulled from NACCAP institutions. These are both relatively limited amounts, but the exposure is not trivial here. That for an institution that awards $1,000 for EFCs in the prior Pell range, 0 to 5,700, now those are, if that institution now has 100 more students that fall into that range, that's potentially $100,000 worth of expenditure exposure there. Separately, you can see on the right, there's a eligibility based on for 1,500, 1,000, 1,500, depending on the EFC. And in particular, the $1,500 grant based on a $0 to $1,000 EFC. If you just flip that to SAI, you could easily have a significant increase in the number of students who qualify for that $1,500 grant. Now, there's good news here, which is that when we talk to prospective students, the hope and the expectation is that if you're awarding additional grant aid, that's also moving the needle on enrollment probability. And that means that you have additional enrollment potentially and additional net revenue to cover that expenditure risk. But we still want to keep our arms around how can we quantify and then how can we plan for the expenditure risk that comes when we have institutional gift aid strategies that use DFC where we would like to adapt them to use SAI. This is probably the most challenging in terms of it being sort of worst defined. Lots of institutions have spent the time since prior year and the earlier FAFSA availability about 7 years ago, building these communication campaigns that are really confident and well done. And they put the information in front of students and families so they know the what, the when, the why, the where, and the how of FAFSA filing, right? And now we don't even know when the FAFSA will be available. And hopefully we get clarity soon, but we shouldn't count on getting that clarity soon. So the question is, how can you motivate action when you can't even promise a specific availability date? So again, hopefully we'll get a signal next week. Hopefully we'll get a signal over the next few months, a firmer commitment to an availability date. Cross our fingers, maybe that'll even be December 1. That's at this point seems like the best case scenario. But if we don't, it's still important to be transparent that while we don't know the when, we still have a lot of information about the what, the why, and the how, right? We know what information students and families will need to have available to complete the FAFSA. We know generally how they'll complete it, and we even have layouts and preliminary layouts of exactly what the questions will look like. And we know the why. The why is still persuasive, that now more than ever, there is an opportunity to avail yourself of every possible dollar of either grant aid from the Department of Education, potentially from the state, from the institution, but also the most advantageous student loan programs in terms of subsidized student loans. So It's true that we don't know the when, and that's frustrating and destabilizing, but we do know the what, the why, and how, and those can still contribute to confident and persuasive communication campaigns. Third, I want to identify some specific resources for preparing and adapting to the new FAFSA. The single best tool is if your institution is a member of the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, NASFA. They publish an SAI modeling tool. I will say that those of you that have already used the SAI modeling tool, it has actually recently been updated to make a few fixes and adjustments in the last 2 weeks. So you might want to go back to it. It is a downloadable Excel resource. This is good and it's bad. It's good because it's a downloadable resource. It's well done. It's recently updated. It provides an opportunity to use inputs from FAFSAs that you collected from students from either aid year 22-23 or 23-24, and use those to both simulate Pell eligibility as well as change from EFC to SAI using the new need analysis methodology or the new SAI formula. So you can look for all of your existing undergraduates who filed the FAFSA. You can feed those through this tool and get an output that says, this was Jane's EFC, this would be her SAI, and this was her Pell eligibility. Now this is her Pell eligibility. That's critical for assessing the extent of change and for assessing the extent to which there is risk for some of your institutional aid policies based on changes from the EFC to the SAI. Here's the problem. It is not as straightforward as it might seem. I think the hope with the modeling tool is that you open it and you'll be providing 10 to 15 fields, or that you'll be able to enter data for individual students and then calculate it. And the reality is that the tool requires more than 100 input fields. And depending on your particular situation, you will probably want to allocate significant time and resources to be able to complete this. You might need to engage colleagues in IT even, or other campus resources. We've worked together with institutions that have done this. Some have internal analytical resources to be able to spend time on this, to export the data, to clean it and format it in the way that the modeling tool expects, and then to make effective use of it. Others, and this might be more typically the case, will need to engage your colleagues in IT or even potentially a vendor partner to assist in extracting this data and putting it through the modeling tool. This is an example of the actual sample output that NASFA provides for the modeling tool. A couple of additional notes here. Only NASFA members are able to download the modeling tool. And that means that if you're working with a vendor and you'd like to ask the vendor for help, folks like us that are partners with institutions, we are able to help interpret the outputs to these data. But because the inputs are complex and come directly from the FAFSA, that's unfortunately a lift that has to occur on the institutional side. But the output is extremely valuable. You can see that by these hypothetical students, an estimated student aid index associated with, in this case, a 2021 aid year current methodology EFC, the difference, as well as the difference in the change to Pell eligibility separately. The tool also provides some visualization, some breakdowns by different student categories, but the most important and the most valuable resource to me is that granular student level information. Apart from the modeling tool, there are other actions we think that you can take now to be ready and more effectively adapt to the new FAFSA. So using that modeling tool, frankly, we work a lot with data. We're data people. Financial aid people tend to be data people and spreadsheet people. So that's going to be the most effective resource for assessing directly the change at your institution. If you work with a vendor now, or if you work on your own in developing an institutional aid strategy, you want to assess the impact to your aid strategy based on those outputs. So if you have a institutional need-based grant that's $1,000 for anyone who's a Pell Grant recipient, and you have the NASFA modeling tool output, and it says your Pell Grant recipients are likely to go from 100 students to 125 students, then you have some information to be able to socialize with leadership. The Pell proportion is going to increase. Students will receive additional grant aid, but this also imposes some additional risk on our institutional expenditure that certainly we hope helps to improve enrollment outcomes for those students. But we want to make sure that, and you would want to make sure that well in advance, you are socializing the potential that there will be additional institutional grant or institutional gift aid allocations based on that new FAFSA. As I mentioned, there's an opportunity to prepare communication plans for students in fall 24, both prospective and continuing students, that even if we don't know the when, We still know the what, the why, and the how, and you can still give clarity to families on what to expect. And even if the when is just December 31st at this point, that can still be an effective message. And one of the things I mentioned to our internal team yesterday and giving a similar presentation is that it's often very clear to families, parents, but also students, which institutions have their stuff together when it comes to the recruitment process. And that's because many students will consider a variety of different institutions, and those institutions will be communicating with them about the same topics. So they get this almost this natural experiment of saying, I'm going to receive 5 different institutions' ways of communicating with me about the FAFSA. And that perception of institutional competence that comes from clear and concise information that's helpful to the family is the sort of thing that can develop the affinity, that can nurture that relationship between the family and the institution. Also, not for nothing, parents are going to prefer to send their son or their daughter to an institution that they believe knows what they're doing and is executing on these critical things like FAFSA and aid eligibility in an effective manner. As a former director of financial aid, one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that it is not only the Office of Financial Aid's responsibility to communicate about aid at your institution, and even if others don't regard it as their responsibility, they're still probably communicating about aid. And that extends to folks on the admission side, admission counselors, if you have a one-stop shop, if you have regional recruiters, but it also extends to even alumni that are involved in the recruitment process. It extends to colleagues in other departments on campus, in student life or residence life or student affairs, that the onus on the institution to communicate effectively about what resources are available to students extends outside the financial aid office. And that means that training opportunities should not be limited to those in the financial aid office. And we'll talk through some resources that are available to give non-technical understanding of the new FAFSA. And we want to make sure that you're making those resources available with two colleagues at the institution that are not centrally responsible for financial aid, but who want to be conversant in these changes so they can counsel students and families more effectively. If that's now, the question is, what about this fall? As we know the FAFSA availability date, you have the opportunity to make those communication campaigns more concrete and begin to aim for, if it's a December 1 or a December 15 or December 31st availability date, and provide more clear dates and deadlines to ease that confusion. So if you're communicating now to say, look, we don't know when, but we know what, why, and how, we want to make sure that you're following up when we know the when to say, now we know, and here's what you can do to be ready. As I mentioned, as you spend the time over the course of the next month, 2-3 months, collecting the information on how this will change things for your students, you also then have the opportunity to finalize adjustments to your institutional gift aid strategies and consider adjustments that might be necessary either to limit risk based on the transition from EFC to SAI, or in some cases, institutions will say, we want to take advantage of this. If we have additional students in our pipeline that now have additional federal grant resources, we'd also like to stack some additional institutional grant there because we can make a persuasive affordability message and improve enrollment outcomes. This is a piece that will resonate most with my financial aid folks on the call. If you work with IT on your campus, if you're working with a vendor for your student information system, it's really critical that you be in regular contact with them, if not already, soon, to say, what is your plan to accommodate the new FAFSA? I have had this conversation with a number of different partner institutions in the last month, and the answers have been various degrees of unsatisfactory. One said the SIS vendor had not responded to their inquiry. One said the SIS vendor said just, we're watching and waiting. I think especially as these file layouts and as the information is coming from the Department of Ed, where vendors can start to take concrete steps to be ready to intake this information and prepare for the 24-25 aid year, limiting your risk is about understanding your vendor's plan or your institution's plan to be ready for the very nuts and bolts aspects of the new FAFSA, which is the ability to take in the data, process it, and package students in a timely and effective manner. Last and very much not least, a lot of what we do in our work is focus on recruitment of new prospective students. If they're first-year students, transfer students, undergraduate, graduate, traditional, non-traditional. One of the most significant impacts of the new FAFSA will be continuing students. And that's because for new prospective families, especially if they don't have older children or older siblings that have already attended college and completed the FAFSA, that 24-25 FAFSA is not going to be new or a departure from a norm. It's all they'll know. The reality is that it's continuing students who are more likely to see that direct change. And in particular, it's continuing students who have who have siblings in college or families that have multiple children in college that could see a significant loss of aid eligibility going from EFC to SAI. Two of the policy interventions we've talked about with institutions. One, if you don't already do this, considering guaranteeing institutional gift aid eligibility to say, if you get a grant as a first-year student, you'll keep it as a sophomore, junior, or senior, even if your SAI is different than what your EFC was. That will have a cost if currently you adjust those based on each aid year's changing data, but it gives clarity in a way that's hard to replicate otherwise, because it gives a promise to students and families that we know things are changing. You might be alarmed. The institution is devoted to affordability and ensuring that you have what you need. And that means we will not take away institutional gift aid next year based on a change to your financial aid eligibility. Separately, as I mentioned, it's going to be frustrating for families that the FAFSA is still going to ask about the number in college, but it also means that even in 24-25, as you're receiving these FAFSAs, you're receiving these ISERs, you're going to be able to assess which students are likely to have been students from families that were impacted by this removal of the number in college criterion. And that means there's an opportunity, if this is in your institution's toolkit, to be proactive about communication to those students and their families and say, look, this is a change. We understand that this might be a significant change to your aid eligibility by the time that the student and the family have seen the outputs from the FAFSA, and proactively communicate and even consider making available resources or a separate appeal or reconsideration avenue for those students. Because again, as continuing students, these are the students, the families that are going to experience the change most acutely, because the change will be very real from what the EFC that they knew to now an SAI. I mentioned some resources. As I said to my internal colleagues the other day, I understand that not everyone, and maybe most, are not going to use technical resources from the NACCAP FAFSA Simplification Web Center or the Department of Ed's FAFSA Simplification Knowledge Center. That's fine. That's for financial aid folks to make use of. But I will say that there are opportunities in both of these to make available to your colleagues on campus non-technical resources. The Department of Ed released a letter recently that's linked on that knowledge center that is designed to be sent to academic leadership like provosts, as well as presidents and board members, that gives or attempts to give a plain English introduction to this topic in a non-technical way. The other resource that I've used a lot over the course of the last month is a Brookings article and a little online simulation made available about a month ago. And it's it's from an academic economist paired with someone from NASFA. And so it provides, again, a plain English, non-technical understanding of the changes that are coming and a way to simulate how that will affect families. Now, what you'll find is that the simulator will estimate gift aid eligibility based on relatively generous institutional policies. So it will say that a student's going to lose significant institutional gift aid, when you might say that's not the reality at our institution because we're not meeting full financial need, or we don't have the resources to offer significant institutional grants. But even apart from the simulation, if you don't find that particularly relevant, it's still critical that we make these non-technical resources available, because the recruitment function, the counseling function, and making sure that students and families are aware of the changes and the aid resources available to them is a responsibility that extends outside the financial aid office. But those folks cannot and should not be expected to have the technical understanding that a financial aid officer does. So those resources are pretty critical, especially that Brookings article, especially some of the more plain English work that the Department of Ed has put out in socializing this change in a way that your colleagues outside the aid office will be able to understand, process, and then communicate back to students and families. With that, I'll kick it to my colleague Ben to see if there are any questions that came up. I know that we technically have exactly 1 minute, but I am fine to give it a few more minutes if those of you would like to stay on and we have additional questions.
Sure, and there were several, and I think one that I actually love, because I think sometimes we just got to ask the question that we might think is simplistic, but I actually think it's really great. So the question is this: should we simply replace EFC with SAI to configure our institutional methodologies, or is that way too simplistic?
So the answer is maybe. And the answer is it depends. And both of those are really unsatisfying. So the reality is that you have to calibrate it based on a few things. One is, what is the appetite of the institution for expenditure risk? If you are at an institution where being $5,000 above budget on an institutional grant program is regarded as a catastrophic outcome by your CFO or president, then you need to be more careful about just replacing EFC with SAI, because SAI is going to be systematically slightly lower. It is going to result in changes that it's unlikely that the loss of grant eligibility for students with siblings in college will offset the expenditure based on the slight reduction in EFC from EFC to SAI. So if you're right on the razor's edge and you have not an ounce worth of latitude in what's on budget for an institutional grant allocation, then I think you need to spend more time, in particular, communicating to institutional leadership that there is risk, trying to quantify the risk, so that next August, when these students are enrolling, you can say confidently to your CFO, your VP enrollment, your president, your provost, we did the best we could with the information we had available at the time. Now, if you have an institution where the institutional grant allocation is flexible, especially flexible according to additional enrollment, you might be able to get away with just replacing EFC with SAI, especially if you have a relatively small Pell Grant population or a relatively small population of students who have significant financial need. The reality is that outside of Pell changes, for most students, that change from EFC to SAI is going to result in something as modest as a slight change to eligibility for a subsidized loan compared to unsubsidized loan. And even then, it's only if they're below a certain EFC barrier or a certain EFC level. So I think that has to be calibrated based on, is our population composed such that we expect there to be a lot of additional eligibility, lots of Pell Grant students, lots of students with an EFC under 10 or 15,000. And am I right on the edge such that it's regarded as a catastrophe if I go $2,500 over on institutional grant? Then I think the onus is on you to be more specific and to communicate more clearly about what's going to happen. Frankly, many of the institutions we work with will happily replace EFC with SAI and move forward, because the rationale is, if it makes students eligible for a bit more grant aid, at least we hope that moves the needle on enrollment for them, and the additional enrollment can generate the revenue to pay for that expenditure risk. So that's how I would calibrate that. But yeah, very institutionally specific.
You had mentioned, and I wonder if this next question is in connection to, you had talked about the competence of an institution really being sort of a strong attractant in helping them see value. I mean, that's sort of experiential, and that makes a lot of sense. And I wonder if this question is related to that. Are there best practices to communicate or market these changes to prospective students and parents? Is that worth considering? Or should we just direct them to federal resources? What is your take on that? Particularly if, and I'm adding here, but particularly if let's say a student's applying to 8 institutions,
right?
And you know that this is going to be messaged in some way, what would you tell the marketing folks would be the best strategy there? And then I think you can prep us for what's next after this.
Anytime you engage a lot of different providers to acquire a service or a product. So I'm not saying that a college enrollment decision is the same thing as buying a car, but if you've had the experience of contacting 5 local dealerships and asking them for information about the exact same car, you've understood that you'll get 5 very different responses. And some of them will be filled with typos and will seem kind of incompetent. And some of them will give you the information you asked for in a timely manner, in a transparent manner, and give you a follow-up, right? And that experience is sort of what happens with students and parents during the prospective stage, especially for students that will consider 5, 7, 9 different institutions. You have to consider the experience for the student or the parents who receive information from the school saying, FAFSA is changing. We're going to push you to the Department of Education's resources, because you can't really push them to NASPA because NASPA is institutionally facing. We're going to push you to the Department of Ed. Department of Ed is regulatory, it's technical, it's very granular, and it's not particularly designed to be presented directly to students. Or the parents who get the communication from the institution saying something significant to you is changing, and we want to talk to you about how it's changing, how this might affect you, and what resources are available to help understand this a bit better. And that takes more effort. It means that the marketing and communication folks at your institution are engaging with the topic experts in financial aid and enrollment to distill what we're talking about here into 3, 4, 5 talking points. It means that you're trying to identify resources that are non-technical or identify explanations that can give a more accessible introduction to these topics for your prospective or continuing students and their families. But I think it pays off because, again, there's nothing so clear to a prospective student or parent during the enrollment or the application process as institutional competence. And are they getting information from institutions that's clear, that's concise, that's written in a non-technical fashion, that gives them what they need when they need it, and is honest about what we don't know, right? The example I'll give is there will be institutions this fall that forget to adjust their communication campaigns, and on October 1, their system will generate an email to every applicant for fall 24 and say, the FAFSA is available, go to fafsa.ed.gov to complete it. And that's an institution where that communication will fall flat. That institution will have a competitor that on October 1 sends out a communication saying, normally the FAFSA would be available today. Things are changing and we want to explain why and how you can adapt to that. So those are very, I don't know that we have the time or the space here to talk through the variety of different ways that we could craft that communication, except to say that when it's clear, concise, and non-technical, and when marketing and communication folks are working together with the subject matter experts in financial aid and enrollment, that's where you get traction that communicates competence and preparation to students and parents. And that's where you get enrollment success. So great questions. I appreciate very much the opportunity to talk to you about this. It's something that's very near and dear to me, both from my own background in financial aid, but also for our partner institutions. And this is something that, of course, this is not the end of this conversation. We will continue to be working on this. Your institutions will continue to be working on this. Your peers, and for those of you in financial aid that can make available additional resources from NASFA over the course of the next few months, this will be very much a group and community effort to adapt to this change. But hopefully, for some of you, this has crystallized how your institution can be ready for this. For others, this has been an injection of enthusiasm or information and enthusiasm to start to be ready, because there is still sufficient time to prepare, but it does require action in the course of the next few months. Our last session of the day begins, we'll have a brief break now because it begins at 2 p.m. Eastern time, and we'll be on aid optimization, and in particular on special topics for Christian institutions, and one that is familiar to me and is a conversation that I think can be a lot of fun, even if it's frustrating, which is what to do with all of those stackable scholarships, those scholarships that are devoted to affinity groups, to parishes, to faith groups, to the community of folks who are allied with your institution, and how to configure those in a way that's optimized while still being able to maintain and build those relationships. So thank you. We appreciate your participation. And for those of you that are going to join us at 2, we look forward to seeing you soon.